The dirt road into Coldwater Flat hadn't changed in 11 years, but Evelyn Mercer walked it now like a stranger, like the ruts in the mud were something she'd never learned to read. Behind her, two men carried the last of what used to be her life out of the house she'd shared with Thomas for a decade. A trunk, a rocking chair with a busted slat, a mirror she'd had since she was 16. Everything else belonged to the bank now. Everything else belonged to men who had never once sat at her table. She stood in the road and watched them load the wagon, and she did not cry, because she had used up all her crying 3 weeks back, the night Thomas didn't come home from the river crossing and two ranch hands brought his hat instead of him. "That's the last of it, Mrs. Mercer," said the younger man, wiping his hands on his trousers like touching her belongings had dirtied them. "Thank you," Evelyn said, because what else was there to say? "Thank you for taking the only home I have. Thank you for being polite while you do it." She was 31 years old and she owned a busted rocking chair, a trunk of clothes, and a mirror. The bank owned the rest. Thomas had borrowed against the land 2 years before he died, money for cattle that got hit with blackleg and dropped dead in the field before they'd turned a profit, and now the debt belonged to a dead man's widow, same as it had belonged to the dead man himself. The town hadn't exactly thrown her out into the street. They were too proud of their own decency for that. Instead, they'd done something almost worse. They'd gathered, the way Coldwater Flat always gathered when there was a problem to be solved that didn't actually involve solving anything difficult. And they'd decided what should happen to her. It was Mrs. Pruitt, the Reverend's wife, who'd come to call on her 2 days after the funeral, sitting stiff in the one chair Evelyn still had, talking like she was delivering good news. "There's the Rowan place," Mrs. Pruitt had said. "Silas Rowan. You know of him." "I know of him," Evelyn had said. Everyone knew of him. He was the man who didn't come to church, didn't come to the social, didn't come to town except when he had to, and even then sent his foreman in his place when he could manage it. A rancher who'd been thrown from a horse 2 years back, or so the story went, and come up from it with a leg that didn't work right and a temperament that worked even worse. He lived alone out past the North Ridge with nobody but an old housekeeper who came twice a week, and the gossip about him had calcified into fact the way gossip in small towns always did, that he was bitter, that he was broken, that he'd likely die out there alone and nobody would know it for a week. "He needs help running that place," Mrs. Pruitt said, "and you need somewhere to be. The Ladies' Aid discussed it, and we think, you discussed my marriage." "We discussed your situation," Mrs. Pruitt said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Evelyn, you have no family here, no money, no house. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because someone has to. What did you imagine you would do? Take in washing? Live off charity?" Evelyn had wanted to say something sharp back, something about how the town hadn't lifted a single hand to help Thomas when his cattle were dying, hadn't offered a dollar or a kindness, and now suddenly cared very much what became of his widow once there was a tidy solution that cost them nothing. But she hadn't said it. She'd sat with her hands folded and let the woman talk because Mrs. Pruitt wasn't wrong about the facts, even if she was wrong about everything else. So here she was, 3 weeks later, riding out to the Rowan Ranch in the back of a borrowed wagon, driven by a boy of maybe 17 who hadn't said 10 words the whole trip, her whole life packed into a trunk behind her, on her way to marry a man she had never spoken to in her life. The ranch came into view slow, the way things did out on the flat. First just a smudge of darker color against the hills, then a fence line, then a house that had clearly once been handsome and was now simply standing, the way a man stands when he's too stubborn to sit down, even though his legs are shaking. The house was a good size, 2 stories, a porch that wrapped around the front, but the paint had gone gray and peeling in patches, and one of the porch posts had been propped up with a length of fence rail instead of fixed. The barn beyond it looked better kept than the house, which told her something, though she wasn't sure yet what. A woman came out onto the porch as the wagon pulled up, heavy-set, gray-haired, an apron over a dark dress, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment before she spoke. "You're the widow Mercer." "I am." "I'm Bertie. I keep house here, such as it is." Bertie's eyes went over her, not unkind, but assessing, like a woman checking a horse's teeth before a trade. "He's in the back room. Won't come out to greet you. I'll tell you that now so you're not surprised by it. He didn't want this arrangement any more than I expect you did." "That's something we have in common then," Evelyn said. Something shifted in Bertie's face. Not quite a smile, but close to one. Come on in. I'll show you where you'll sleep, and then I expect you'd best go say hello, because if I have to be the one to drag him out there, neither of us is going to enjoy the rest of the afternoon. The inside of the house matched the outside. Bones of something fine, gone neglected. A good staircase with a wobbling rail. A parlor with furniture that had been quality once, now dusty and pushed against the walls like nobody used the room at all. Bertie led her up to a small bedroom at the end of the hall, plain, clean, a narrow bed and a washstand and a window looking out over the back pasture. "This'll be yours," Bertie said. "His room's downstairs now, off the kitchen. Easier on the leg not having to manage stairs." She set Evelyn's trunk down at the foot of the bed with more force than it needed. "I'll say this once, Mrs. Mercer, and then I won't say it again. He's not what they say in town. He's hard. I won't lie to you about that. Hard as a man can be without breaking clean through. But there's a difference between hard and cruel, and you'll learn it if you give yourself the chance. And if I don't, then you'll have a miserable few years, and so will he, and I'll have to listen to both of you," Bertie said, and walked back out, leaving Evelyn alone in a room that smelled like nobody had opened the window in a long time. She found him in what must have been a study once. Bookshelves along one wall, half empty now, a desk covered in papers that looked disorganized even from the doorway. He was sitting in a chair by the window with his bad leg stretched out in front of him on a low stool, a cane leaning against the wall within reach, and he didn't look up when she came in, though she was certain he'd heard her. Silas Rowan was younger than she'd expected, not yet 40 by the look of him, though there was gray coming in early at his temples and lines around his eyes that hadn't come from age so much as pain held too long without rest. He had a strong jaw gone tight with the effort of being still, and forearms that still carried the muscle of a man who used to work hard for a living before whatever had happened to him took that away. "Mr. Rowan," she said, "you're here then." His voice was low, flat, the voice of a man conserving energy he didn't have to spare on pleasantries. "I suppose you'd best sit down. We've a wedding to get through by all accounts, and I'd rather it be over than drawn out." "That's a fine way to greet your bride," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. That got his attention. He turned his head and looked at her properly for the first time, and his eyes were a sharp, pale gray, the kind of eyes that didn't miss much even when the rest of the man looked like he'd stopped trying. "You want flowers and sweet talk, Mrs. Mercer? I haven't got either to give. I've got a ranch that's bleeding money I can't track, a leg that doesn't work, and a town that decided between themselves that you and I ought to be married without either of us being consulted about it, same as I imagine the cattle aren't consulted about which pasture they get moved to. I'll feed you, I'll give you a roof, and I'll expect you to run this house, since Bertie can't do it all, and I sure as hell can't. Beyond that, I don't see what either of us has to offer the other in the way of romance, so let's not pretend at it." There was a long silence. Out the window, a hawk was circling low over the back pasture, and Evelyn watched it instead of him for a moment, gathering herself. "All right," she said finally. "Then we understand each other. I didn't come here for romance either, Mr. Rowan. I came here because I had a husband who's dead, and a town that decided my fate, same as they decided yours. And unlike you, I don't even have a ranch bleeding money. I haven't got anything at all. So we're not so different in that respect. We're both being handed something we didn't ask for. I'd rather we found a way to be civil about it than spend however many years we've got making each other miserable out of spite." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, like he was recalculating something. "You've got more spine than I expected," he said. "You expected a woman who'd weep in the corner and wait for you to tell her what to do." "I expected exactly that, yes." "Well, you'll be disappointed in that regard, Mr. Rowan, but I expect you'll manage." Something passed over his face that might, in a man less guarded, have been the beginning of a smile, but he covered it by reaching for his cane and pulling himself up, wincing as he did, the leg clearly costing him more than he let his face show. "The preacher's coming Thursday," he said. "Won't be a fuss made of it. I'd rather it not be." "Suits me fine. Then I suppose there's nothing else to discuss." He limped past her toward the door and stopped, just for a second, his back to her. "Bertie will have shown you your room. I won't come up there, and I won't expect you down here either, past what the house requires. You understand me." It wasn't a question. "I understand you," she said. He left without another word, and Evelyn stood alone in the study with its half-empty shelves and its disorganized desk, and thought that she had just agreed to marry a man who told her, in the same breath, that he wanted nothing from her, and that she'd best not expect anything either. She thought of Thomas, who had laughed easily and loved her plainly, and was now 6 weeks dead in the ground behind the church. And she thought that grief made strange bedfellows of people, and that this house, whatever else it was at least a roof. And a roof was more than she'd had 3 days ago. She went to find Bertie and asked where the kitchen ledgers were kept, because if she was going to run this house, she intended to actually run it. The wedding, when it came, was exactly as small and joyless as Silas had promised. The preacher, not Reverend Pruitt himself, but his younger associate, a thin man named Hargrove who looked uncomfortable the whole time, read the vows in the parlor with Bertie and one of the ranch hands as witnesses. Silas stood through it, leaning more heavily than usual on his cane, his jaw set the way it had been the day Evelyn met him, and when it came time to say his vows, he said them flat and fast, like a man reading off a list of chores. Evelyn matched his tone, because there seemed no point pretending otherwise, and when Hargrove pronounced them married, Silas simply nodded once and said, "Obliged, Reverend," and that was the whole of it. No supper after, no well-wishing. Bertie put out a plain meal that evening, and the three of them ate at the kitchen table mostly in silence, Silas's eyes on his plate, until finally he pushed back his chair, said, "I've work to look at before dark," and left, his cane tapping against the floorboards down the hall. Bertie watched him go, then looked at Evelyn with something like sympathy. "Don't take it personal." "I'm not taking anything personal, Bertie. I married a stranger for a roof over my head. I didn't expect a love song." "No," Bertie said slowly, "but you might get more than you think, given time. He wasn't always like this." "What was he like before?" Bertie hesitated, then shook her head, the way people did when they'd decided a story wasn't theirs to tell. "Before the accident, he laughed. He don't laugh now, that's all I'll say on it." She stood and started clearing the plates. "You'd best get some sleep. There's a lot needs doing around here, and now that you're mistress of it, I expect you'll be the one doing most of it." The first week settled into a rhythm that was, if not comfortable, at least bearable. Evelyn rose early, same as she always had, and found there was more to running the Rowan house than Silas or Bertie had let on. The kitchen garden had gone to weeds. The linens hadn't been properly aired in months. There was dust in corners that suggested Bertie, for all her good intentions, simply couldn't manage a house this size on top of cooking and the few other chores she already carried twice a week, alone. Evelyn threw herself into it, partly because it was something to do with her hands that kept her mind off everything she'd lost, and partly because some old stubborn part of her, the same part that had argued with Mrs. Pruitt without quite winning, the same part that had told Silas Rowan flat to his face that she wasn't going to weep in a corner, refused to live in a house that looked neglected, even a house that wasn't hers by anything but a piece of paper and a fast-spoken vow. She didn't see much of Silas those first days. He kept to the study or out by the barn on the mornings when his leg allowed it, leaning hard on his cane, directing the two ranch hands, a young man named Casper and an older one named Tully, from a distance rather than working alongside them, which she suspected ate at him more than he'd ever say. He came to meals because Bertie insisted on it, but he ate fast and said little, and disappeared again before the dishes were cleared. It was on the 9th day that Evelyn finally lost her patience with the silence. She'd been going through the kitchen accounts, trying to make sense of how much was being spent on supplies against how much the ranch was bringing in, and the numbers didn't sit right. Feed costs that seemed high for the size of the herd Casper had mentioned. A receipt for fencing wire that didn't match what she could see had actually been used, based on a walk she'd taken along the near pasture that morning. She wasn't an accountant, but Thomas had kept careless books too, in his time, and she'd learned the shape of numbers that didn't tell the truth. She found Silas in the study, the same chair, the same window, papers scattered same as the first day she'd met him, except now there was a fresh stack that looked like it hadn't been touched in a week. "Mr. Rowan?" "Silas," he said, without looking up. "We're married. You can use my name." "Silas, then." She set the ledger down on the edge of his desk. "These numbers don't add up." That got him to look up. "What numbers?"
The feed bills, they're higher than they should be for the herd size Casper described to me. And there's a receipt here for wire that doesn't match what's actually fenced. I walked the pasture myself this morning.
He was quiet for a moment, studying her, and then he reached for the ledger and pulled it toward him, flipping back through the pages with more interest than she'd seen him show in anything since she'd arrived. I haven't kept close track of this in some time, he admitted, and there was something almost like shame in the way he said it, quick and clipped, like the words cost him. Gideon's been handling most of the business side since the accident. Contracts, supply orders. I haven't the head for sitting at a desk all day, and someone had to do it. Gideon? Gideon Blackwell, family friend, goes back to my father's time. He stepped in when I couldn't manage, and I've been grateful for it, frankly, because there wasn't anybody else offering. He closed the ledger, his jaw tight. You're saying the numbers are wrong. I'm saying they're worth asking about. Gideon's been straight with me my whole life. He doesn't need to skim from a crippled man who can't hardly check his own fences. There was an edge in his voice now, defensive in a way that told her she'd touched something he didn't like touched. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Silas. I'm telling you what the numbers say, and you can do with that information whatever you like. She kept her voice even. I didn't come here to make trouble for you, but I also didn't come here to keep books for a household that's bleeding money out the back while everyone pretends not to notice, because eventually that bleeding becomes a hole too big to patch, and I've seen what that looks like. I watched it happen to my first husband. The silence stretched, and for a moment she thought she'd overstepped badly enough that he'd send her right back to the kitchen and tell her to mind her business. But instead he looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first day, recalculating something behind those sharp gray eyes. You kept books before. I kept Thomas's books. What books he let me keep. He didn't like a woman in his business affairs any more than most men do. I watched him lose the ranch anyway, piece by piece, because he trusted the wrong people and didn't look close enough at numbers that should have worried him. She held his gaze. I'm not saying that's what's happening here. I'm saying I know what it looks like when it starts, and this looks like that. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked down at the ledger again, his thumb running along the edge of the page, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. Go through it, he said. All of it. Every book, every contract you can find. I want to know what you find before I say another word to Gideon about anything. You believe me then? I believe the numbers. When somebody actually shows me the numbers instead of just telling me to trust them, he said, and there was something dry and almost wry in it, the first thing close to humor she'd heard from him. Go on, you've clearly already started. Might as well finish. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working in stolen hours between the cooking and the cleaning and the garden to go through everything she could find. Old contracts stuffed in drawers, receipts shoved into a cigar box, a half-kept ledger that picked up and dropped off in fits depending, she guessed, on how good or bad Silas's leg had been on a given week. The picture that emerged wasn't clean, and it wasn't simple, but it was troubling. Cattle that had been sold off at prices well under what the same stock fetched at the county market, according to prices Tully mentioned in passing one afternoon when she asked him outright, careful not to let on why she was asking. Supply contracts with a feed merchant in town that seemed to charge the Rowan Ranch a different rate than what Casper said other outfits paid for the same goods. And running through nearly every transaction, the same name signed at the bottom in a confident, looping hand, Gideon Blackwell, acting on behalf of S. Rowan. She didn't go to Silas with it right away, partly because she wanted to be sure, and partly, if she was honest with herself, because she'd come to understand in those 2 weeks that trust was a thing this man doled out like water in a drought, and she didn't want to waste what little she'd earned on an accusation she couldn't fully back up. So she watched, instead. She watched the way Gideon Blackwell rode out to the ranch every week or so, a heavy-set man with an easy smile and a handshake that lasted a beat too long, the kind of charm that worked well on people who didn't look too closely. She watched how he talked to Silas, solicitous, almost paternal, always with some new piece of business that needed Silas's signature and rarely much explanation beyond, trust me, same as your father did. And she watched how Gideon looked at her. It was subtle, the first few times. A comment here about how a young widow ought to be careful, taking on so much responsibility so soon in a new marriage. Maybe she ought to let him handle the harder business and just focus on the house. A remark there about how surprising it was that Silas had taken to a wife so quickly when he'd sworn off marriage for 2 years running. Wasn't that interesting? Wasn't that worth wondering about? It was the third visit, when Gideon caught her alone in the kitchen while Silas was out checking fence with Tully, that the subtlety dropped away enough for her to see something underneath it that made her skin go cold. "You've been busy, I hear," Gideon said, leaning against the doorframe in a way that took up more space than it needed to. "Going through old papers, asking Tully about cattle prices." "I'm the mistress of this house now," Evelyn said.
"I like to understand where the money goes." "That's admirable." His smile didn't move past his mouth. "Though I'd hate for you to misunderstand things you don't have the full picture of. Ranch business is complicated. Years of history behind every contract. A woman new to the place could easily get the wrong idea about a number that looks strange on its own, but makes perfect sense once you know the whole story." "Then perhaps you could tell me the whole story, Mr. Blackwell."
"I'd be glad to hear it." His eyes held hers a beat too long. "Perhaps I will, when there's time. For now, I'd advise you focus on what you came here to do. Keep this house running. Keep that man comfortable. He's been through enough without his new wife stirring up confusion over business she doesn't understand. Wouldn't want her getting tired of him so soon after the wedding, would we? Folks in town would talk." It wasn't a threat, exactly. He'd built it carefully enough that she couldn't repeat it back to anyone and have it sound like one, but she understood it for what it was, standing there in her own kitchen with a stranger's smile aimed at her like a blade held just out of sight. And she understood, with a cold certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that Bertie's warning about Gideon Blackwell, vague as it had not been vague enough. "I understand you, Mr. Blackwell," she said, echoing without meaning to the same words she'd said to Silas on her first day in this house. "Good." His smile widened, satisfied, and he pushed off the doorframe and walked back out toward his horse, whistling something under his breath, like a man who believed the matter was settled. Evelyn stood in the kitchen a long while after he'd gone, the ledger still open on the table where she'd left it, and thought about the numbers that didn't add up, and the man who'd had an accident 2 years back that nobody quite described in detail, and the way Gideon Blackwell had looked at her like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. She thought, too, about Silas, sitting in his study with his bad leg and his sharp eyes, a man everyone in town had decided was finished, broken, a burden to be handed off to a desperate widow so the two of them could fade quietly out of everyone's concern together. She did not believe anymore that his leg had broken by accident. She had no proof of it. Not yet. But the feeling sat in her gut, same as the bad numbers had. A wrongness she couldn't yet name but couldn't ignore either. And Evelyn Rowan now, she supposed, though the name still sat strange on her tongue, closed the ledger, squared her shoulders, and decided that whatever else this marriage was or wasn't, whatever else this house demanded of her, she was not going to be a woman who looked away from a wrong simply because looking away was easier. She had already lost one husband to men who took more than they gave. She was not going to stand by and watch it happen to a second. That evening, when Silas came in from the barn, sweat-soaked and pale with the effort the walk had cost him, lowering himself into his chair at the table with a grimace he didn't bother hiding from her anymore, Evelyn set his plate down in front of him and said simply, "I need to talk to you about Gideon Blackwell. Tonight, after supper." Silas looked up at her, something wary moving behind those gray eyes. And for the first time since she'd arrived at this ranch, he didn't tell her no. Silas didn't answer right away. He sat with his fork halfway to his mouth, looking at her like she'd said something in a language he had to translate first. And then he set the fork down and pushed his plate a few inches away, the way a man does when he's decided food isn't going to be the thing that happens next. "Talk then," he said. "No sense waiting on it." "After Bertie's gone for the night," Evelyn said, "this isn't a kitchen conversation." So they waited, the two of them, through the rest of a silent meal, and Evelyn watched him watching her, trying to read what was coming and clearly not liking that he couldn't. When Bertie finally untied her apron and said her goodnights, and the wagon took her back toward her own little place a mile off, Evelyn banked the stove, lit a second lamp, and carried the ledger and the cigar box of receipts into the study where Silas had already settled himself, his bad leg up on the stool, his face arranged into the careful blankness he wore like armor. "All right," he said. "Let's hear it." She didn't waste time working up to it. She'd learned enough about this man in 2 weeks to know he had no patience for a story told sideways. "Gideon caught me in the kitchen today while you were out at the fence with Tully," she said. "He told me in so many words that I should mind the house and leave the business to him. Said a new wife asking questions about contracts could look bad. Said folks would talk if I tired of you so soon." Something moved across Silas's face, fast and dark. "He said that to you." He said it smiling, which was worse. She set the ledger down on the desk between them. "And then he left like the matter was settled. Silas, I don't know this man. I don't know your history with him, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've got it all figured out after 2 weeks of going through old receipts. But I know what it sounds like when somebody's trying to warn a woman off looking too close at something. And that's exactly what that was." Silas was quiet a long moment, his jaw working, and when he spoke his voice had gone low and rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Gideon's been coming round this ranch since before I could walk a straight line, Evelyn. He sat at my father's table. He stood up at my father's funeral and spoke when I couldn't get the words out myself. When I went down off of that horse 2 years back and couldn't hardly sit up in bed for 3 months, he's the one who kept this place from going under entirely, far as I knew it." He shook his head slowly. "I don't like what you're telling me. I don't like it at all. But I also know a man can wear a kind face for 30 years and still rot underneath it. And I'm not so proud that I won't look at what's in front of me just because it's ugly." "Then look," Evelyn said, and opened the ledger to the pages she'd marked. She walked him through it slow, the way she'd worked it out herself. The cattle sales that came in under the going county rate, 3 separate times over the last year and a half, each one signed off by Gideon on Silas's behalf. The feed contracts with the merchant in town, a man named Otis Granger, charging the Rowan Ranch nearly a third more per sack than what Casper swore other outfits in the valley paid for the same grain. The fencing wire bought and paid for that didn't match what had actually gone up along the pastures she'd walked herself. Silas listened without interrupting, which she came to understand later was not a small thing for him, a man more used to barking orders than receiving information he hadn't asked for. When she finished, he sat staring at the ledger like it had personally betrayed him. "Why?" he said finally, not really a question, more a man thinking aloud. "He's got money of his own. More than I do, probably, even with what he's skimmed here. Why bother with a crippled rancher's nickel and dime cattle money?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn admitted. "Maybe it's not really about the money. Maybe the money's just easy, on account of nobody's been watching it close enough to notice. Or maybe there's something more to it I haven't found." She hesitated, then decided this was a night for saying things plainly, since the alternative was letting it fester unspoken between them. "Silas, how did your accident happen?" His whole body went still in a way that told her she'd hit something raw before he even opened his mouth. "I was thrown," he said. "Bad horse, bad ground, bad luck. There's not much of a story to it beyond that." "Do you remember it? The throw itself?" "Some of it. Not all." His voice had gone careful now, the way a man's voice goes when he's walking on ground he doesn't trust. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because a man who skims cattle money off a crippled rancher and then warns the rancher's new wife not to look too close at the books is not a man I'd put much faith in when it comes to an accident nobody else saw happen." She kept her voice steady, even though her heart was going fast. "I'm not saying I know anything. I'm saying I think it's worth asking the question, and I think you've maybe never let yourself ask it, because the answer might be worse than just bad luck." Silas didn't say anything for a long while. He looked at his own leg, stretched out useless on the stool in front of him, like it belonged to someone else. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier roughness and gone flat and quiet instead. "I was out checking the north fence line alone," he said. "Gideon had told me there were cattle drifting through a gap up there, said he'd seen it himself the day before and meant to ride out and look, but got pulled away on other business. Asked if I'd go check it, since I knew that stretch better than anybody. I went. Horse spooked at something, I never did see what, and went down hard on rocky ground, and I went down with him, and that was the last clear thing I remember before I woke up 3 days later in my own bed with Bertie crying over me, and a doctor from 2 counties over telling me I'd be lucky to walk again at all." "Who found you?" "Gideon did," Silas said, and the words came out slow, like he was hearing the shape of them for the first time, even though he'd surely told this story before. "Said he got worried when I didn't come back by dark.
Rode out looking, found me near dead by the fence line, carried me back himself. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere off toward the barn, a dog barked once and went still. Silas, Evelyn said carefully, I'm not telling you your friend tried to kill you. I don't have any proof of that, and accusing a man of something like that without proof would be its own kind of wrong. But I'm telling you that the same man who sent you out alone to a stretch of fence where you nearly died, the same man who happened to be the one who found you, is also the same man who's been quietly draining money out of this ranch for going on 2 years while you couldn't get up to check the books yourself. That's not nothing. That's a pattern, even if I can't yet tell you what it adds up to. He sat with that for a long time, his face unreadable, and then he reached for his cane, pulled himself up off the chair with the same wincing effort she'd watched him make a dozen times now, and limped over to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the barn against the night sky. I owe that man my ranch, he said quietly, his back to her. Or I thought I did. 2 years I've sat in this chair believing I owed him everything, that without him, this whole place would have gone under the same week I went down off that horse. And you're telling me he's the reason I went down off that horse in the first place. I'm not telling you that, Evelyn said. I'm telling you it's a question worth asking. There's a difference. Is there? He turned back to face her, and there was something in his expression now that hadn't been there before. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something harder and more focused than either. 2 years, Evelyn. 2 years I let that man run my business because I couldn't manage it myself, and the whole time I thought I was being looked after. If what you're saying is even half true, then I haven't been looked after at all. I've been managed, same as cattle, same as you said. In fact, the day you walked in here, consulted about as much as livestock gets consulted on which pasture it's moved to. Then let's find out the truth of it, Evelyn said. Properly. Not guesses and not gut feelings, but proof we could put in front of a judge if it came to that. I'll keep going through the books. I'll talk to people in town where I can, careful, so nobody runs straight back to Gideon with word of it. And in the meantime, she hesitated because this part felt like it mattered more than the rest, even though it sat outside the ledgers and the contracts. In the meantime, I think we ought to look at that leg of yours. Silas's eyebrows went up. My leg? You've had 2 years of a doctor from 2 counties over telling you you'd be lucky to walk. And as far as I can tell, nobody's actually tried much of anything since. You sit. You use the cane. You wince every time you stand up like it's the first time you've ever tried it. That's not treatment, Silas. That's surrender. And I don't think you're really a man built for surrender, not if the last hour is anything to judge by. You don't know the first thing about doctoring. No, Evelyn agreed. But I grew up the daughter of a man who broke his back in a fall and spent the rest of his life telling everyone the leg was done for, until my mother, who also didn't know the first thing about doctoring, started making him walk the length of the porch every single day no matter how much he hollered about it. And within a year, he was walking into town on his own 2 feet, slower than before, but walking. I'm not promising you'll be racing horses again. I'm saying 2 years of sitting still hasn't fixed anything, and it might be time to try something other than sitting still. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse outright, tell her to mind her own business, same as he'd told her the business about Gideon wasn't hers to question. But something in his face had shifted since she'd told him what she suspected about the accident. Some old stubbornness rising back up through 2 years of resignation, like a man remembering a part of himself he'd set down and forgotten he was allowed to pick back up. All right, he said finally. Tomorrow. We'll see what foolishness you've got in mind, and if it doesn't kill me, maybe we'll try it again the day after. What Evelyn had in mind was not foolishness, though it took the better part of a week before Silas stopped saying so out loud every time she came to fetch him. She started small, the way her mother had started with her father. Not the porch yet, not yet anything that demanded he stand on the leg longer than he could bear, but simple things first, sitting him in a chair and having him push his foot against her 2 flat hands, testing what strength was still there beneath the stiffness and the scar tissue she glimpsed once when his trouser leg rode up and he yanked it back down too fast for her to see much beyond the rough, twisted shape of old injury badly healed. She had him work the ankle in slow circles, one way and then the other, however much it hurt, however much he swore under his breath doing it. This isn't a doctor's treatment, he said the 3rd day, sweat standing out on his forehead from an exercise that, to anyone watching,
would have looked like nothing at all. This is a woman making up nonsense and calling it medicine. Does it hurt less than it did 3 days ago? He didn't answer that, which she took correctly as a yes. By the second week, she had him on his feet at the end of the hallway, one hand on the wall, walking the short distance to the kitchen door and back. No cane, just her arm under his when his knee threatened to buckle, which it did, often, sending him cursing and red-faced and furious at his own body in a way that told her exactly how much this had cost his pride over the 2 years he'd spent letting himself believe nothing could be done. "This is humiliating," he snapped one afternoon, after his leg gave out for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, and he had to grab the wall hard enough that his knuckles went white. "It's not humiliating, it's hard," Evelyn said, steadying him without making a show of it. "Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel like it right now." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one falling down in your own hallway like a newborn calf." "No," she agreed. "I'm the one who watched my father do the exact same thing for the better part of a year, hollering the exact same kind of things you're hollering now, and I watched him walk into town a year later same as ever, so you'll forgive me if I'm not as impressed by your suffering as you'd like me to be." That got something out of him that was almost a laugh. More a short, surprised huff of breath than an actual laugh. But it was the first sound close to good humor she'd heard from him since she'd arrived, and something in her chest went warm and strange at having drawn it out of him. "You're a hard woman, Evelyn Rowan." "I've been told." "By who?" "By you twice now, in the last minute alone." This time the sound he made really was a laugh, short and rusty, like a hinge that hadn't been used in too long, and he shook his head and pushed himself off the wall to try the walk again. And this time he made it 3 more steps than he had before falling, and Evelyn counted it, silently, as a victory worth having. The weeks that followed settled into something that felt less like 2 strangers occupying the same house, and more like 2 people, slowly, carefully, building something neither of them had words for yet. Mornings, Evelyn worked the ledgers and made quiet, careful trips into town under the excuse of household errands, asking questions where she could without raising suspicion, a word here with Otis Granger's clerk about feed prices, phrased like idle curiosity from a new bride trying to understand her husband's affairs. A conversation with the county clerk's office about land records, dressed up as concern over inheritance papers now that she was a married woman again. Afternoons, she worked Silas's leg, pushing him a little further each day, past his complaints, past his pride, until the walk down the hallway became a walk out onto the porch, and then a walk the length of the porch and back, his hand resting lighter and lighter on her arm with each passing week. He talked more, too, as the weeks went on. Not easily, not the way Thomas used to talk, all warmth and ease, but in fits and starts, like a man unlocking doors he'd shut a long time ago and wasn't sure he remembered how to open. He told her about his father, a hard man who'd built the ranch from nothing and never once told his son he'd done a job well, no matter how well the job was done. He told her, one evening on the porch with the sun going down orange over the western ridge, about the years before the accident, when he used to ride out before dawn just to watch the light come up over the north pasture, alone, because there was something in that hour that belonged only to him. "I haven't seen that sunrise in 2 years," he said quietly. "Sounds foolish missing a sunrise, but I do." "It's not foolish," Evelyn said. "I miss things too, small things." The sound Thomas used to make clearing his throat before he said something he thought was clever. "I'd give a great deal to hear that sound again, foolish as it is." Silas looked at her for a long moment in the fading light. "You loved him." "I did, plainly and easily, the way you love a man who never once made you work hard for his affection." She looked out at the ridge instead of at Silas because it felt easier to say the next part without his eyes on her. "This is different. I'm not asking it to be the same. I'm only saying I understand something about losing a life you thought you'd have and building toward whatever comes after, even when you don't particularly want to. We have that much in common, whatever else we don't." He didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice had gone rougher than usual. "I don't know what I am to you, Evelyn. Husband seems like the wrong word for what I've given you so far. You've given me a roof and a fair hand at the table, and you've trusted me with your books and your leg both, which I don't imagine you've trusted easily to anybody in 2 years, Evelyn said. "I'd call that something. I'm not in a hurry to name it exactly."
No, he agreed slowly. Neither am I.
It was the closest either of them had come to saying anything true about what was growing between them, and neither pushed it further that evening, content instead to sit in the dimming light and watch the ridge go purple and then black. Two people who had started as strangers forced together by a town's tidy arithmetic, becoming slowly something neither of them had words for and both of them, in their separate quiet ways, had begun to want. But if the ranch was healing in some ways, it was fraying in others, and Evelyn's careful inquiries in town had not gone as unnoticed as she'd hoped. She felt it first in small things. Otis Granger's clerk, who'd answered her questions easily enough the first time, grew suddenly cagey the second time she came round, claiming he couldn't recall the prices she was asking about, looking past her shoulder like he expected someone to walk in and catch him talking. The county clerk, similarly, who'd been helpful enough with the land records the first visit, told her on her second that certain documents had been misfiled and might take some time to locate, his manner gone stiff and formal in a way it hadn't been before. And then there was Gideon himself, who came round the ranch more frequently now, his visits stretching longer, his manner toward Silas warmer and more solicitous than ever, while his manner toward Evelyn grew colder by degrees each time, the charm dropping away a little more with every visit, until what was left underneath looked, to Evelyn's eye, distinctly like a man calculating his odds. "You're looking well, Silas," Gideon said one afternoon, watching with poorly hidden surprise as Silas walked out onto the porch to greet him, without his cane for the first stretch of the distance, only reaching for it once he'd made it to the rail. "Better than I've seen you in some time." "Evelyn's been working my leg," Silas said, and there was a note of pride in it that hadn't been there in any of his earlier conversations about himself in months, by Bertie's account. "Slow going, but it's going." "Is that so?" Gideon's eyes flicked toward Evelyn, standing in the doorway, and the look he gave her was not the look of a man pleased to see his old friend improving. It lasted only a second before he covered it with a smile, but Evelyn caught it and filed it away, same as she'd filed away every other small wrongness since the day she'd arrived at this ranch. "Well, wonderful news, truly, though I'd hate for you to push too hard, Silas. The doctor was clear 2 years back that this leg might never bear weight properly again. Wouldn't want a setback." "The doctor was clear about a lot of things that turned out wrong," Silas said. "Doctors generally know their business better than housewives with no medical training," Gideon said, lightly enough that it could have passed for a joke, except for the way his eyes stayed flat and cold on Evelyn while he said it. "I'd say the proof's standing on the porch without his cane for the first time in 2 years, Evelyn said, keeping her voice pleasant, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "But I understand if that's hard for you to credit, Mr. Blackwell, given how invested you've been in keeping him exactly as he was." It was the first time she'd said anything close to an accusation out loud, in front of Silas, in front of Gideon both, and she watched it land. Watched Gideon's jaw tighten just slightly, watched something pass behind his eyes that was gone again before Silas, watching his friend rather than his wife, could catch it. "I beg your pardon," Gideon said, very evenly. "Nothing to pardon," Evelyn said. "Only an observation. Will you stay for supper, Mr. Blackwell? I've got a stew on." "I think I'll be heading back, thank you," Gideon said, and his voice had cooled several more degrees in the span of a sentence. "Silas, I'll come by again later in the week when we can talk business properly. There are some contracts that'll need your signature soon, the feed order for the autumn especially. Can't let that slip past the date or Granger'll charge us a penalty." "I'll look forward to it," Silas said, and Gideon nodded, tipped his hat with stiff politeness toward Evelyn, and rode off down the lane without his usual parting warmth. Silas watched him go, leaning against the porch rail, his expression thoughtful in a way Evelyn hadn't seen before. "You don't like him," he said, once Gideon was well out of earshot. "I don't trust him," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference, same as you said about hard and cruel." "He looked at you like he wanted to put a fist through something," Silas said slowly. "I've known that man 30 years, and I've never once seen that look on his face before today." "Maybe he's never had reason to wear it before today," Evelyn said. "Maybe nobody's ever stood on his porch and told him straight out that he was invested in keeping you broken." Silas turned to look at her, and the weight of what she'd said seemed to settle on him fully for the first time. No longer an abstract suspicion turned over quietly between the two of them in the dark of the study, but something real,
Something that had just stood in his own front yard wearing his oldest friend's face and looking at his wife like she was an obstacle that needed clearing. "I want the contracts," he said quietly. "The ones he's bringing by this week."
I want to see every one of them before I sign a thing, and I want you looking over my shoulder while I read them, because 4 eyes are better than 2 when it comes to a man who's apparently been writing his own fortune into the fine print of mine. "I'll be there," Evelyn said. "And Evelyn," his voice had gone lower, rougher, the way it did when he was saying something that cost him to say.
"Whatever this turns out to be, whatever he's done, however deep it runs, I want you to know I see what you've done these past weeks. The books, the leg, standing on my own porch and saying out loud what I didn't have the stomach to say myself. I don't know how to thank a person properly for that kind of thing. I'm not sure I've ever had to." "You don't have to thank me," Evelyn said. "We're in this together now, whether either of us planned for it. That's worth something, isn't it?" "It's worth a great deal more than I expected it to be the day you walked up that road," Silas said, and for the first time since she'd known him, he reached out and took her hand just for a moment, just long enough to mean something, before letting it go and turning back toward the house, leaving her standing on the porch with her heart beating strange and quick, watching the dust Gideon's horse had kicked up settle slowly back down over the empty lane. Gideon came back 3 days later, just as he said he would, with a leather satchel of papers and a smile that didn't sit right on his face anymore, not since the afternoon on the porch, when Evelyn had said her piece out loud. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table across from him and Silas both, same as Silas had asked, and watched the way Gideon's eyes kept cutting toward her every time he set a new paper down in front of his old friend. "This is the feed contract for autumn," Gideon said, sliding a page across the table. "Same terms as last year. Granger's holding the price steady as a favor, given the years we've done business." "Same terms as last year," Silas repeated, and instead of reaching for the pen the way he might have a month ago, he picked the paper up and read it, slow, line by line, his lips moving slightly the way a man's do when he's reading something he means to actually understand rather than simply sign. Gideon watched this with poorly concealed impatience. "It's the standard contract, Silas. You've signed it every year for going on 5 years now without trouble." "Then it won't trouble me to read it through once more," Silas said, not looking up. Evelyn kept quiet, her hands folded in her lap, letting Silas do exactly what she'd hoped he'd do, which was simply slow down. She'd learned enough in the weeks of going through the ledgers to know that men like Gideon Blackwell didn't rely on lies so much as they relied on speed, on contracts signed in the time it took to refill a coffee cup, on numbers nobody had the patience or the standing to question. Slowing a thing down was sometimes the whole of the fight. "Here," Silas said after a long minute, setting his finger down on a clause near the bottom of the page. "This wasn't in last year's contract. A penalty clause here says if deliveries refused or delayed past the date specified, the Rowan Ranch owes Granger a fee equal to a quarter of the contract value." "A formality," Gideon said. "Granger's been burned by late ranchers before. It's standard now, across the valley." "Is it?" Silas looked up at him. "Tully's cousin runs cattle for the Whitfield spread, and he mentioned to me not 2 weeks back that Granger's never once charged them a penalty clause in 15 years of doing business. Strange that he'd start fresh with us." The kitchen went very quiet. Evelyn watched Gideon's jaw work, watched him reach for his easy smile and find it didn't come quite as easily as it usually did. "I couldn't say why Granger structures one contract different from another," Gideon said finally. "Perhaps the Whitfields negotiate harder than you do, Silas. No offense meant. If you're unhappy with the terms, by all means, don't sign it. I only brought it round as a courtesy, same as I've done for years, to save you the trouble of riding into town yourself in your condition." There it was again, that small, deliberate reminder of his condition, dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, meant to ripple outward and remind Silas exactly what he was supposed to believe himself capable of, and not. "I think," Silas said slowly, "I'll ride into town myself this week and speak with Granger directly. Save you the trouble of carrying papers back and forth on my account." Something flickered across Gideon's face, there and gone so fast that if Evelyn hadn't been watching for exactly this kind of thing for weeks now, she might have missed it entirely. It wasn't surprise. It was something closer to alarm. "There's no need for that," Gideon said, too quickly.
I'm happy to handle it, same as always. No sense exhausting yourself over a feed contract. I'm not exhausted, Silas said. In fact, I find myself with rather more energy these days than I've had in some time. He set the contract back down on the table, unsigned. I'll look it over with fresh eyes before I sign anything. Leave it here. I'll send word when I'm decided. Gideon's mouth tightened just for a second before he covered it. Of course. Whatever suits you. He gathered the rest of his papers back into the satchel with movements that were a fraction too sharp to be entirely casual, and stood. I'll let you get on with your evening then. Mrs. Rowan? He nodded toward Evelyn, and this time there was no pretense of warmth in it at all, just a flat, measuring look that made the hair on her arms rise. He left without another word, and Silas watched him go through the front window, his expression thoughtful and a little grim. He didn't like that, Silas said. No, Evelyn agreed. He didn't. It was 3 days after that, on a morning when Silas had actually ridden, on a horse for the first time in 2 years, a short, careful loop around the near pasture that left him pale and shaking with the effort, but grinning, genuinely grinning in a way Evelyn hadn't seen from him before. That Gideon came back to the ranch alone, on foot from where he'd tied his horse a ways off, and found Evelyn hanging wash in the side yard with nobody else around to hear. She felt him before she saw him, the particular wrongness of a presence that didn't belong, and turned to find him standing closer than was decent, his hat pushed back, his easy smile gone entirely now, replaced by something colder and far more honest. Mr. Blackwell, she said, keeping her voice level even as her pulse picked up. I didn't hear you ride in. I didn't want you to, Gideon said. We need to talk, Mrs. Rowan, you and I'd rather it be a private conversation. Then say what you've come to say. He stepped closer, and Evelyn made herself stand her ground, even though every instinct told her to step back. You're a clever woman. Cleverer than this town gave you credit for, I'll admit. Going through old books, asking questions in town that you think nobody's noticed, working that man's leg until he's fool enough to think he can ride a horse again. He can ride a horse, Evelyn said. I watched him do it not an hour ago. For now, Gideon said. Leg like that, pushed too hard, too fast. These things have a way of going wrong again. Worse than before sometimes. He let that sit a moment, and the meaning underneath it landed exactly as cold as he'd intended. I'm going to give you the chance to stop, Mrs. Rowan. Stop the doctoring. Stop the questions in town. Stop whatever it is you think you're building a case toward, because I promise you, you don't have the first idea what you're poking at. And I'd hate to see harm come to a man who's only just started feeling like himself again. Evelyn's blood went cold, but she kept her voice steady, the same steadiness that had carried her through losing Thomas, through the town's tidy arithmetic of her future, through every moment in this house that had asked more of her than she thought she had to give. Are you threatening my husband, Mr. Blackwell? I'm advising you, Gideon said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Accidents happen on ranches all the time. Horses spook. Fences give way. Men with bad legs fall down stairs they shouldn't be climbing in the first place. I'd hate for any of that to happen to Silas. Truly I would. He's like a brother to me. But I'd hate it more if you forced my hand by continuing to dig where you've got no business digging. And if I tell him what you just said to me? Gideon's smile came back, thin and humorless. Tell him whatever you like. He'll believe what he wants to believe, same as he has for 2 years now. A grieving widow with nothing to her name, suddenly seeing conspiracies behind every feed bill, eager to make herself indispensable to a lonely cripple so she's got somewhere to land? That story sells itself in this town, Mrs. Rowan, and you know it better than anybody, given how quick they were to marry you off in the first place. Push this, and I'll make sure that's the story everyone hears. Not mine, yours. The desperate widow who manipulated a broken man for his land and his money. He turned and walked back toward where he'd left his horse, his pace unhurried, a man entirely confident in the weight of his own threat, and Evelyn stood among the wet linens hanging in the yard, her hands trembling, not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but from a rage so clean and total it nearly took her breath. She did not go to Silas that day. Not because she meant to keep it from him. She had promised herself, weeks back, that whatever else this marriage was, it would not be built on the kind of withheld truth that had eaten away at her first one. But because she understood, standing in that yard with her heart pounding, that telling Silas now with nothing in hand but a threat and her own word against Gideon's would only give Gideon exactly what he wanted, a fight between husband and wife that he could shape however suited him, while the actual proof he was so desperate to keep buried stayed buried right alongside it. So instead, that night, after Silas had gone to bed exhausted and aching but proud of the morning's ride, Evelyn sat alone in the study by lamplight and began to write down everything. Every number, every name, every date, the cattle sales below market price, the inflated feed contracts, the fencing wire bought and never used, the strange new penalty clause that no other ranch in the valley seemed to carry. And beneath all of it, in careful letters, the question that had been sitting in her chest like a stone since the night Silas told her about the accident: who sent him out alone to that fence line, and who was the only man who happened to find him? The work of the next 2 weeks was careful, patient, and dangerous. In a way, Evelyn felt every time she rode into town on some household errand and had to remind herself to keep her face arranged into the same mild pleasantness it had always worn, even while her mind ran fast and cold beneath it. She started with Otis Granger's clerk, a nervous young man named Pete, who'd grown skittish the second time she'd asked about feed prices. She found him alone one afternoon, restocking shelves, while Granger himself was off at the bank, and instead of asking him outright, she simply set a small jar of preserves on the counter. A gift, she told him, for his trouble the other week, and waited, letting the silence do the work. "I didn't mean to be unhelpful before," Pete said finally, not meeting her eyes, fussing with a row of tins that didn't need fussing with. "Only Mr. Blackwell came by after you'd asked. Told Mr. Granger he'd appreciate it if certain old records weren't discussed with customers. Said it was a private business matter between him and Mr. Rowan." "What records, Pete?" He hesitated, and she could see the fight in him. The part of him that wanted to keep his job, and the part of him, younger and less worn down, that didn't like what he'd seen and hadn't found anyone willing to ask him about it directly until now. "The penalty clause," he said quietly. "It's new, mister." Granger didn't even draw it up himself. Mr. Blackwell brought the language to him already written, said it was standard now, asked him to put it in. Mr. Granger does what Mr. Blackwell tells him, on account of Mr. Blackwell holds the note on this store, has for near 3 years. Evelyn felt something settle into place, cold and certain. "Blackwell holds the note on Granger's store?" "Yes'm. Granger near went under after a bad winter and missed her. Blackwell loaned him what he needed to keep the doors open. Granger's been paying it back since, but slow, and Mr. Blackwell's been particular about what he asks for in return. Better prices on certain accounts, certain clauses written in certain ways." Pete glanced toward the door, lowering his voice further. "I don't like it, Mrs. Rowan, if I'm honest. But I've got a mother to feed, and Mr. Granger's the only work I've found in this town that pays steady." "I understand," Evelyn said gently. "You've helped me more than you know, Pete. I won't bring trouble to your door over it." "Just be careful, ma'am," Pete said, his young face suddenly serious in a way that aged him 10 years. "Mr. Blackwell's not a man who likes being looked at too close. There's talk, quiet talk, about what happened out at the Whitfield spread 2 years back before they sold off most of their herd and moved east. Folks don't say it loud, but there's some who think Blackwell had a hand in souring that outfit too, before they ever decided to leave." This was new, a thread Evelyn hadn't pulled at before. What happened to the Whitfields? Same kind of thing, near as anybody could tell. Contracts that didn't make sense. An accident that put old Whitfield himself in a bad way for a spell, before he finally just sold out cheap and left the valley altogether. Blackwell ended up buying a good piece of that land off him, quiet-like, through a cousin of his so it wouldn't look like his name was on it. Pete shook his head. Nobody ever proved anything. Nobody ever asked hard enough to prove anything, far as I know. It just sort of happened, and then it was over, and everybody moved on like that's how things go out here. Evelyn left the store with her heart hammering and her mind racing through everything she now understood differently. This was not a man skimming a little money off a crippled friend out of simple greed. This was a pattern, a method, refined over years, of finding men weakened by accident or misfortune and quietly, patiently, taking what they could no longer hold on to themselves. And if it had happened to the Whitfields, and it was happening now to Silas, then Gideon Blackwell was not simply a thief. He was something far more dangerous and far more deliberate. and Evelyn understood with a sick certainty that she was no longer simply uncovering old fraud. She was circling the edge of something that had already cost at least one family everything they had, and very nearly cost Silas his life into the bargain. She found the second thread of proof almost by accident, the way the most important things sometimes come, not through careful planning, but through a chance conversation with Tully one evening while Silas was inside resting his leg after a longer walk than usual. "You ever wonder, ma'am," Tully said, working a piece of leather harness with his weathered hands, not looking up, "why the boss went out alone to that north fence the day he went down? He told me Gideon asked him to check it, said there were cattle drifting through a gap." Tully's hand stilled for a moment. "That's curious, ma'am, on account of I was the one mending that exact stretch of fence not 3 days before, on Mr. Blackwell's instruction, and I'd swear on my mother's grave there wasn't a gap left in it when I finished. I checked it myself, twice over, the way Mr. Blackwell asked me to on account of he said the boss had complained about cattle getting through there before." Evelyn went very still. "You're saying the fence was sound?" "Sound as any fence on this ranch, ma'am. Which is why it struck me strange when word came that the boss had gone down out there, that there'd been a gap at all for cattle to drift through in the first place." Tully finally looked up at her, his old eyes careful, weighing how much to say. "I never told anybody that. Didn't seem my place, and the boss was in such a state for so long after, nobody was much in the mood for questions about fences. But you've been asking around, ma'am, careful as you've tried to be about it, and I figured maybe it was time somebody who actually mended that fence said something about it." "Would you say it again? In front of someone official, if it came to that? A judge? A sheriff?" Tully considered this for a long moment, and Evelyn could see the weight of it on him. An old ranch hand who'd spent his whole life keeping his head down and his opinions to himself, now being asked to stand up and say something that could cost him whatever quiet peace he'd built for himself in this valley. "I would," he said finally. "The boss has always been fair with me, ma'am. More than fair. And I never liked the way Mr. Blackwell looked at this place after the accident. Like a man counting coins he already considered his own. If it comes to standing up and saying what I know, I'll stand up. It was not proof enough on its own. An old hand's recollection of a fence mended days before an accident against the word of a man as respected and well-liked as Gideon Blackwell had spent 30 years building himself to be. But it was another thread, and threads, woven together carefully enough, eventually became rope strong enough to hold real weight. Evelyn spent that night writing it all down by lamplight again, Tully's account alongside Pete's, alongside the numbers in the ledger, and she began for the first time to see the shape of an actual case forming, not just suspicion, not just a wrongness in her gut, but something with edges, something a person could hold up to the light and see clearly for what it was. Well, it was nearly 3 weeks later, with Silas walking the length of the pasture fence most mornings now, and talking more and more about cattle drives he meant to oversee himself come spring, that Evelyn finally found the piece that turned everything from suspicion into certainty. It came from a source she hadn't expected. The old doctor, Dr. Hale, who'd treated Silas in the weeks after the accident before retiring out to a small place near the river, his practice handed off to a younger man in town. She'd gone to see him on the pretense of asking after remedies for Silas's continued recovery, and found him a kindly, tired old man, glad for the company and willing to talk more freely than perhaps he should have, given how long it had been since anyone had asked him anything at all about that long-ago patient. "Strangest thing about that injury," Dr. Hale said, settling into his chair with the easy garrulousness of a man who'd spent too many recent years alone, "was the bruising pattern. I noted it at the time, though I never made much of it to anybody, since the man was near dying and there wasn't time to be asking questions about how exactly he came to be that way." "What about the bruising, doctor?" "A fall from a horse. You'd expect bruising consistent with impact, shoulder, hip, the side that took the ground. And he had that, sure enough. But there was bruising on his back too, ma'am, low across the shoulders, the kind of mark you'd see from something striking down rather than from a body striking the earth. I noted it in my records at the time as unusual, though I confess I let it go, given everyone was so certain it was a horse fall, and there seemed no reason to argue otherwise." Evelyn's heart was pounding now, hard enough she could feel it in her throat. "Do you still have those records, doctor?" "I expect I do, somewhere in my old trunk of papers. I kept careful notes my whole career, ma'am. habit of a lifetime, hard to break even in retirement. He studied her for a moment, his tired eyes sharpening with sudden understanding. You're not asking after remedies at all, are you, Mrs. Rowan? No, sir, Evelyn admitted. I'm asking because I believe someone hurt my husband deliberately 2 years ago and made it look like an accident, and I think your old notes might be the proof I need to show it. Dr. Hales sat with that a long moment, his weathered face working through something complicated, and then he nodded slowly. I always wondered. Never had cause to say so out loud since nobody asked, and a man my age learns not to go stirring trouble he can't finish stirring. But I'll find those records for you, Mrs. Rowan. I'll find them and you can have them. And if it comes to a courtroom, I'll say what I saw under oath, same as I'd say it to you now. A man deserves to know the truth of what happened to him, however late it comes. He found the records before she left that afternoon, yellowed pages in his own careful hand, describing in plain medical language a pattern of injury inconsistent with a simple fall, bruising across the lower back and shoulders suggestive of a blow delivered before or alongside the fall itself, the kind of mark, the old doctor's notes read, more often seen in cases of deliberate assault than equestrian accident. Evelyn rode home with those pages folded carefully inside her coat, her mind a storm of fear and fury both, and she understood now, fully and completely, what she had been circling for weeks without quite letting herself believe it. Silas had not been thrown from a horse by bad luck. Someone had struck him down, on a fence line that had been sound days before, sent there by the one man who'd then conveniently been the one to find him, the one man who'd spent 2 years afterward quietly bleeding the ranch dry while playing the part of the loyal family friend, the one man who had just 3 weeks ago stood in her own yard and threatened to do it all again if she didn't stop. She did not go straight to Silas with it. She rode instead to the small house where Tully lived, found him mending harness on his own porch, same as always, and showed him the doctor's notes, watching his weathered face go hard and grim as he read them. That settles it, far as I'm concerned, Tully said quietly. I'll stand up and say what I saw, whatever it costs me. Thank you, Tully. Don't thank me yet, ma'am. He handed the pages back to her carefully, like they might burn him. Man like Blackwell, cornered like this is going to corner him soon. That's a dangerous thing. You be careful how you handle what you've found. He's already threatened you once by what you told me. A man who'll strike down his own oldest friend for land and money isn't going to think twice about silencing a widow he already considers a problem. Evelyn rode home in the gathering dusk with that warning sitting heavy in her chest, the doctor's notes pressed against her ribs inside her coat, and understood that whatever came next, the quiet war she'd been fighting in ledgers and careful questions was about to become something far more open, far more dangerous, and far harder to walk away from than anything she'd faced since the day she'd watched 2 men carry the last of her old life out of a house that no longer belonged to her. She found Silas waiting on the porch when she rode in, his bad leg propped on the rail, watching the road the way he'd taken to doing lately, and something in his face when he saw her, relief, plain and unguarded, the look of a man who'd been worrying after someone he'd grown to care for, told her that whatever happened next, she was no longer facing it alone, the way she'd faced so much else in her life. You look like you've seen a ghost, Silas said, watching her dismount. I think I have, Evelyn said quietly. Silas, I need to show you something, and I need you to sit down first because I don't think you're going to take it well standing up. His face went still and careful, the way it had the night she'd first told him to wonder about his own accident. Tell me, he said. Inside, Evelyn said. Please, this isn't a porch conversation either. Silas read the doctor's notes twice over at the kitchen table, his face going through something that started as disbelief and settled, slowly, into a kind of cold, contained fury Evelyn hadn't seen from him before. Not the flat irritation he'd worn the first weeks of their marriage. Not even the sharp anger he'd shown the day Gideon insulted her on the porch. But something deeper and older, like a man finally allowed to grieve a thing he'd been forbidden from grieving for 2 years because he hadn't known it was a thing worth grieving at all. Bruising across the back, he said quietly, his finger tracing the old doctor's careful handwriting. I remember that. I remember Bertie crying over me, dabbing something on my shoulders, and I thought at the time it was from the fall, from hitting the ground hard. I never once thought... He stopped, his jaw working,
Somebody hit me, Evelyn, before I ever went down. Somebody struck me down on my own land and then carried me home and let me believe for 2 years that I owed him my life. Tully says the fence was sound days before, Evelyn said gently. He mended it himself on Gideon's instruction, checked it twice. There was no gap for cattle to drift through. Gideon sent you out there alone, to a stretch of fence that didn't need checking, and he was the one who found you after. Silas set the papers down very carefully, like his hands didn't quite trust themselves not to crumple them, and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing. 2 years, he said finally. 2 years I sat in that study feeling grateful to a man who put me there, signing whatever he brought me because I trusted him with my eyes closed, letting him bleed this ranch dry while I thanked him for the privilege. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and Evelyn understood that whatever fury he was feeling toward Gideon, there was a deeper wound underneath it, the particular pain of having been made a fool of by someone he'd loved like family. What kind of man does that to a friend? The kind who was never really a friend, Evelyn said. Pete at the store told me about the Whitfields 2 years back. A similar pattern, an accident, a man weakened, contracts that didn't make sense, and then the family selling out cheap, while Gideon ended up with a piece of their land through a cousin's name. I think this is what he does, Silas. I think he's done it before, and he meant to do it again to you, and he'd have kept doing it to whoever came next if somebody hadn't finally looked close enough to see the pattern. Silas was quiet a long while, and when he finally looked up at her, there was something steadier in his face. The fury banked down into something colder and more useful. "What do we do with this?" he said. "Tully's word, the doctor's notes, your ledgers. Is it enough?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "It might be enough to raise real doubt. It might not be enough to convict him of anything outright, not without more. But it's enough, I think, to bring before the sheriff, and enough to make sure that whatever Gideon tries next, he can't simply talk his way past it the way he's talked his way past everything else in this town for 30 years. Then we bring it to the sheriff." "Not yet," Evelyn said, and when Silas's eyebrows went up, she pressed on quickly. "Silas, listen to me. Gideon spent 30 years building a name in this town as a decent, generous man. The friend who held the ranch together after the accident. The man who loaned Granger money to save his store. The man everyone trusts without question. If we go to the sheriff now, quiet, with what we've got, Gideon will hear of it within the day, same as he heard about my questions in town within days of asking them. He'll have time to cover his tracks, to threaten Tully into silence, maybe worse. We need to do this in a way that doesn't give him room to maneuver. We need it to happen all at once, in front of people, where he can't talk his way around it after the fact." Silas studied her for a long moment, something like admiration moving behind his eyes despite the grief and anger still sitting heavy in his face. "You've thought about this already." "I've thought about little else for 3 weeks," Evelyn said. "I think there's a town meeting coming, isn't there? The harvest gathering, the one Mrs. Pruitt's been organizing, half the valley turns out for it. The sheriff will be there, Granger will be there. If we're going to do this, I think it should be there, in front of everyone, so there's no quiet way for him to make it disappear afterward. And if he strikes first," Silas said slowly, "if he hears we're gathering proof and decides to move before we're ready." It was a fair worry, and one Evelyn had turned over in her own mind more nights than she cared to admit, lying awake listening to the wind move through the eaves of a house that had started, somewhere in the last 2 months, to feel less like a stranger's roof and more like her own. "Then we'll have to be ready sooner than we'd like," she said. "I'll finish copying everything this week. Every number, every name, every witness account, written out clean so it can't be mistaken or twisted. And Silas," she hesitated because this part mattered more than the rest, and she wanted to say it plainly. "Whatever happens, whatever he tries, I'm not backing down from this. He threatened me to my face in our own yard, told me to stop working your leg, told me he'd let it go wrong worse than before if I didn't stop. I've spent enough of my life letting men decide what I'm allowed to fight for. I'm done with that." Silas reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had on the porch weeks before, except this time he didn't let go after a moment. He held it, his thumb moving slowly over her knuckles, his gray eyes steady on hers. "He threatened you," he said quietly,
and you didn't tell me. I was going to. I needed proof first, or it would have just been my word against his, and you'd seen for 20 years how that man could talk his way around anything. I'm not angry you waited, Silas said. I'm angry that he ever thought he could put his hand anywhere near you and walk away from it. There was something fierce in his voice now, something that hadn't been there in the early weeks of careful, distant civility, and Evelyn understood, with a warmth that settled somewhere deep in her chest, that whatever this marriage had started as, it had become something else entirely, something neither of them had words for yet, but something real, something worth protecting fiercely on both sides now. Word of the harvest gathering reached the ranch the way most news did in Coldwater Flat, through Bertie, who heard it from the butcher's wife, who heard it from half the town. It was to be held in the church hall, same as every year, with tables of food and an evening of fiddle music and neighbors catching up on a season's worth of gossip, and the whole valley would turn out for it the way they turned out for every excuse to break the monotony of ranch life. Evelyn spent the days leading up to it finishing her work, clean copies of every ledger entry, every contract discrepancy, written out in a hand clear enough that anyone could follow it without needing her there to explain. She rode out to see Dr. Hale once more to confirm he'd be willing to attend the gathering himself, old as he was, and the kindly doctor agreed without hesitation, saying it was past time he stood up for something instead of simply writing it down in a trunk of old papers nobody asked to see. She spoke with Tully again, too, and found him resolute, his earlier nervousness settled into a quiet, stubborn determination that reminded her, in its way, of Silas himself. What she did not anticipate, what nobody anticipated, least of all Evelyn, who'd spent 3 weeks being so careful about every question she asked and every person she spoke to, was that Gideon Blackwell had been watching far more closely than any of them realized, and that he had decided, in the days before the gathering, that the safest course was not to wait for whatever Evelyn might bring before the town, but to strike first and shape the story in his own favor before she ever had the chance. The morning of the gathering, Bertie came rushing into the kitchen, her face pale, a piece of paper in her hand. "Mrs. Rowan, there's talk all over town already. Mr. Blackwell's been saying things, terrible things about you." "What kind of things?" "That you've been going around asking strange questions, stirring up lies about him to cover your own scheming. That you married Silas only because you'd lost everything and needed somewhere to land, and now you're trying to push him further than his leg can bear so you can claim you've done some great service and take control of his affairs entirely. He's been saying it to half the town, Mrs. Rowan, and folks are listening because he's Gideon Blackwell, and you're—" Bertie trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought, but Evelyn finished it for her. "And I'm the desperate widow nobody wanted to keep," Evelyn said quietly. "Same story he told me he'd tell, the day he threatened me in the yard." Silas, who'd come into the kitchen in time to hear the last of it, went very still, his face hardening into something Evelyn hadn't seen from him before. Not the cold withdrawal of their first days together, but something focused and dangerous, a man preparing for a fight he intended to win. "Then we go tonight," he said, "same as we planned. Only now we go knowing he's already trying to get ahead of us. Let him talk. Let him build his story as big and loud as he likes in front of the whole town, and then let's see how it holds up once the truth's sitting right there next to it." The church hall was packed by the time Evelyn and Silas arrived that evening, lanterns strung along the rafters, tables groaning under the weight of pies and roasted meats, the fiddle player tuning up in the corner while children ran between the legs of adults too busy gossiping to mind them. Evelyn felt every eye in the room turn toward them the moment they walked through the door. Silas walking without his cane, slower than a man who'd never been hurt, but walking upright, his head held high in a way the town hadn't seen from him in 2 years. The whispers started immediately. She caught fragments of them as they made their way toward a table near the front. "That's the widow, isn't it? The one who married the Rowan boy? Well, don't he look better than anybody expected? Wonder what she's done to him. Wonder what Gideon meant about her scheming." Gideon was already there, near the front of the hall, deep in conversation with the sheriff. A heavy-set man named Caldwell, who'd held the post for longer than Evelyn had lived in this valley, and several of the town's more prominent men, his face arranged into an expression of grave, reluctant concern that Evelyn recognized immediately as performance. It was Mrs. Pruitt who called this gathering to order, same as she did every year, welcoming everyone to the harvest celebration, And it was barely 5 minutes into her remarks about the season's good crops before Gideon stepped forward, his voice raised just enough to carry, his face arranged into the careful sorrow of a man who hated what he was about to do but felt it his duty. "Forgive the interruption, Mrs. Pruitt, but I think there's a matter the whole community ought to hear before we go further, given how many of you have known Silas Rowan his whole life, same as I have." He turned deliberately to face the room, and his eyes found Evelyn across the hall with the cold precision of a man who'd planned exactly this moment. "I've held my tongue for weeks, hoping things would resolve themselves quietly, but I can't stay silent any longer. Not when I've watched a vulnerable man pushed past his limits by a woman who married him for desperation and has spent every week since trying to make herself indispensable to his affairs." A murmur ran through the room, heads turning, and Evelyn felt Silas go rigid beside her, his hand finding hers under the table. "She's been going through his books without his understanding of what she's truly doing with them," Gideon continued, his voice rising with practiced conviction. "Asking strange questions all over town, pushing that leg of his far past what any doctor would advise, risking permanent harm, because the more dependent and impressed he becomes, the more control she stands to gain over a ranch and a fortune that rightfully belongs to him and his family alone. I've tried to warn her privately to stop, more than once, for his sake. She didn't listen. So now I'm asking this community, who knew this man before tragedy struck him down, to see what's happening here before it's too late to undo it." The room had gone fully silent now. Every face turned toward Evelyn, and she felt the old familiar weight of it. The town's collective judgment, the same tidy arithmetic that had decided her fate once already, now apparently deciding it again. She felt Mrs. Pruitt's eyes on her, felt the sheriff's careful, professional scrutiny, felt 100 small calculations being made about who she was and what she deserved. She had been here before, in a way, standing in a room while people who barely knew her decided what kind of woman she must be. The difference this time was that she had something in her hands that the last time she hadn't. Proof, careful and patient and complete. And she was no longer the same desperate widow who'd stood silent while Mrs. Pruitt arranged her future for her. Evelyn stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt, and when she spoke, her voice carried clear and steady through the hushed hall. "I'd like to respond to that, if the room will allow me." "By all means," Mrs. Pruitt said, though her tone suggested she expected little good to come of it. "Mr. Blackwell has just told you I've been going through ledgers without my husband's understanding," Evelyn said. "That's not true. Silas asked me himself 3 weeks ago to go through every book and every contract on that ranch, because the numbers I found troubled him as much as they troubled me. He sat beside me through every page of it." She turned deliberately to look at Gideon and let her gaze hold there long enough that the room felt it. "What I found, Mr. Blackwell, were cattle sold 3 separate times at prices well under county market rate, every sale signed by you on Silas's behalf. Feed contracts charging the Rowan Ranch nearly a third more than other outfits in this valley pay for the same grain, run through Otis Granger's store, a store you hold the note on and have for 3 years, which gives you a great deal of say over what gets written into its contracts." A ripple moved through the crowd, sharper this time, and Evelyn saw Granger himself, standing near the back, go pale. "I found a penalty clause inserted into this year's feed contract that exists nowhere else in this valley's business dealings, according to Granger's own clerk, who can speak to it himself if anyone cares to ask him." She reached into the bag at her side and drew out the papers she'd carried with her all evening, holding them up so the lamplight caught the careful columns of figures. "I have it all written here, every transaction, every discrepancy, going back nearly 2 years, roughly to the time of Silas's accident, in fact." "This is exactly what I warned you about," Gideon said, his voice sharpening, though there was a thread of something underneath the confidence now that hadn't been there a moment before. A woman with no head for business, misreading simple contracts and turning ordinary arrangements into some grand conspiracy because it suits her purposes. "Then perhaps the sheriff would like to hear from Tully, who's worked this ranch for going on 8 years, Evelyn said, "and who mended the fence on the north line himself, on your express instruction 3 days before Silas's accident, and who'll tell you, under oath if it comes to it, that there was no gap in that fence for cattle to drift through, despite what you told Silas the day you sent him out there alone." The hall had gone utterly silent now. Tully, who Evelyn had asked to attend that evening without telling him precisely when his part might come, stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the door, his hat in his hands, his weathered face grim and steady. "It's true," he said, his voice rough but carrying clear through the hushed room. "I checked that fence twice over on Mr. Blackwell's own instruction. There wasn't a gap in it. I never understood why the boss got sent out there at all, if I'm honest. But I never said so out loud till now, since nobody asked, and I had no proof of anything beyond my own memory of mending a fence. And perhaps," Evelyn continued, her voice steady even as her heart hammered, "the sheriff would also care to hear from Dr. Hale, who treated Silas in the days after his accident." Doctor Hale stepped forward from his seat near the front, leaning on a cane of his own, his old voice carrying with surprising strength. "I noted at the time bruising across Mr. Rowan's lower back and shoulders, inconsistent with a simple fall, the kind of marking more often seen in cases of deliberate assault. I kept my notes, as I keep all my notes, and I have brought them tonight, should the sheriff care to examine them." He produced the yellowed pages from inside his coat, holding them out, and the sheriff, his expression gone carefully neutral now, the easy social warmth drained entirely from his face, stepped forward to take them. Gideon's composure was cracking now, visible to the whole room, his easy charm replaced by something tight and cornered. "This is absurd. A retired doctor's faded memory, a ranch hand's recollection of a fence he mended 2 years ago, a widow's ledger, figures that could be explained a dozen ways if anyone bothered to ask me directly, instead of staging this spectacle in front of the entire town. Then explain them, Mr. Blackwell," came a voice from the doorway, low and rough and absolutely certain, and every head in the hall turned to see Silas Rowan standing there, having walked, alone, the length of the hall, while everyone's attention had been fixed on the unfolding confrontation, his cane left behind at the table, standing on his own 2 feet without support of any kind, proud and upright in front of every soul in Coldwater Flat, who had spent 2 years believing him broken beyond repair. The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn watched the town's collective disbelief move across face after face. The same faces that had decided her future once without asking. The same faces that had whispered about the broken rancher fading away on his lonely ranch, now staring at a man standing tall in front of them, every assumption they'd carried about him for 2 years crumbling in real time. "Silas," Gideon said, and for the first time his voice cracked, the mask finally fully gone. "You're standing?" "I'm standing," Silas agreed, his voice carrying clear and hard through the hall, "because my wife spent 2 months working a leg you spent 2 years telling me was finished, same as you spent 2 years telling me you were the only reason this ranch hadn't gone under, while the whole time you were the one bleeding it dry. You sent me out to a fence that didn't need checking, Gideon. You struck me down on my own land and carried me home and let me thank you for it for 2 years running. And then you threatened my wife in our own yard when she got too close to the truth of it." "I never—" Gideon started, but the room had already turned against him, the murmurs rising now into something louder, angrier, the sheriff stepping forward with the doctor's notes still in his hand, his face set hard. "Gideon," Sheriff Caldwell said, "I think you and I need to talk right now, somewhere quieter than this hall, and I'd advise you think carefully about how you answer me." Gideon's eyes swept the room one last time, searching for some sympathetic face, some way to turn this back in his favor, the way he'd turned every other difficulty in 30 years of careful charm, and found nothing, only a town's worth of people who'd believed him for decades now, looking at him like they were seeing him clearly for the very first time. "This isn't finished," he said low, to Evelyn alone, as the sheriff's hand closed around his arm. "It is, Mr. Blackwell," Evelyn said. "It's been finished since the day you decided a crippled man's leg and his wife's intelligence were both things you could underestimate forever." The sheriff let him out, and the hall erupted into noise the moment the door swung shut behind them. 100 conversations at once. The gathering's mood shattered entirely, and through all of it, Silas crossed the remaining distance to where Evelyn stood, reaching for her hand in front of the entire town that had once decided their marriage without asking either of them, and held it tight, his eyes bright with something that looked finally like the beginning of relief. The days after the gathering moved strange and slow, the way days do after something breaks open that's been sealed shut a long time. Sheriff Caldwell rode out to the ranch twice that first week, once to collect Evelyn's ledgers and written accounts as formal evidence, and once to tell them, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, that Gideon Blackwell had been charged. Fraud, falsification of contracts, and pending further investigation, assault on the strength of Dr. Hale's notes and Tully's sworn account, and a search of Gideon's own papers that turned up records even more damning than what Evelyn had managed to find on her own. Found correspondence going back near 3 years, Caldwell said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. Letters between him and a cousin out east about land near the Whitfield spread. Looks like your suspicions about that family weren't far wrong either, Mrs. Rowan. We'll be looking into that too, now that we know to look. What happens to him? Silas asked. Judge will decide that come the circuit next month. But I'll tell you plain, Silas, I've known that man 20 years, sat at his table, called him friend same as you did, and I don't think there's a soul in this valley who's going to speak up for him once this all comes out proper in a courtroom. A man can fool a town for a long while. He can't fool it forever, not once the proof's sitting right there in black and white for anybody to read. It was, in its way, a small and unglamorous ending to something that had nearly cost Silas his life, and very nearly his ranch besides. No dramatic confrontation, no chase across open country, just paperwork and testimony, and a circuit judge who'd hear the case in due course. The slow, grinding machinery of law doing what it was built to do, however imperfectly, however late. Evelyn found she didn't mind the lack of drama in it. She'd had enough drama for one lifetime, standing in a church hall with the whole town's eyes on her, and she found she was glad now for something as plain and solid as paperwork, as a sheriff's careful procedure, as a judge somewhere down the line who would weigh evidence rather than gossip. The town itself took longer to settle than the legal proceedings did, and Evelyn found herself, in the weeks that followed, the subject of an entirely different kind of attention than she'd grown used to. Where once people had looked at her with a kind of pitying tolerance, the desperate widow, married off for her own good, a problem the town had solved by handing her to a broken man nobody else wanted. Now they looked at her with something closer to wariness, even respect, the way people look at someone who has proven herself capable of more than they'd ever credited her for. Mrs. Pruitt came to call again less than a month after the gathering, sitting in the same parlor chair she'd sat in once before, though her manner this time carried none of its old certainty. I owe you an apology, I think, Mrs. Pruitt said, twisting her gloves in her lap. We none of us thought much of you when we arranged things. I won't pretend otherwise, since you'd see through the pretending anyway. We thought we were solving 2 problems with one tidy solution, and we never once considered there might be more to either of you than the town had decided. You weren't wrong that I needed somewhere to land, Evelyn said, without bitterness, because she found, sitting there, that she genuinely no longer carried much bitterness toward this woman, however clumsy and cold her interference had been. You were wrong about what kind of woman I'd be once I landed there. Yes, Mrs. Pruitt said. I see that now. The whole town sees it now, frankly, which I expect is small comfort given how little any of us did to deserve being proven wrong by you, instead of simply trusting you from the start. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, and Evelyn didn't pretend to herself that it was. Mrs. Pruitt's apology came easier because it cost her nothing now that Evelyn had already won, and there was a kind of truth in that worth noticing without dwelling on too long. But it was something, a small crack of decency in a town that had shown her precious little of it when it might have actually mattered, and Evelyn decided, turning it over afterward, that she would rather meet people where they finally arrived than spend the rest of her life punishing them for how long the journey had taken. Silas's recovery, in those same weeks, continued at a pace that surprised even Evelyn, who'd believed in it from the start but hadn't quite let herself imagine how far it might go. He rode out most mornings now, checking fence line himself instead of directing Casper and Tully from a distance. His limp still there, would likely always be there to some degree, the leg never quite forgetting what had been done to it. But he moved through his days now like a man living in his own life again rather than watching it happen around him, and Evelyn found there was nothing in the world quite like watching someone come back to themselves after believing, for 2 long years, that the coming back simply wasn't possible. He found her one evening out by the garden, pulling the last of the season's beans before the frost took them, and he didn't say anything for a moment, just stood watching her work with an expression she'd come to recognize over the months, something quiet and full, that he still wasn't entirely comfortable putting into words, though he'd gotten better at it than the man who'd told her, on her first day in this house, that he had neither flowers nor sweet talk to offer her. "I rode the full loop today," he said finally. "North fence to the river crossing and back. Didn't need to stop once." "That's good news." "It's more than good news, Evelyn. 2 years ago, I couldn't make it from my bed to the window without Bertie's arm under mine. Today, I rode 6 miles and felt better at the end of it than I have in longer than I can remember." He came closer, leaning against the garden fence, watching her hands move through the bean vines. "I keep thinking about what you said that first week about your father, about how 2 years of sitting still hadn't fixed anything. I remember. I was so sure you were wrong, so sure I knew the shape of my own ruin better than some stranger who'd been in my house a handful of days." He shook his head slowly. "I think that's the thing nobody tells you about being broken, Evelyn. You start to believe the broken part is the truest part of you, the part that finally makes sense of everything else that's gone wrong. And you'd almost rather keep believing it than risk being wrong about how unfixable you are. It's easier somehow to stay sat down than to stand up and find out you can't." "I know," Evelyn said quietly, setting down the basket of beans because she understood this in her own way. Had understood it since the day the bank took her house, and the town decided her future, and some old stubborn part of her had nearly let herself believe she deserved no better than whatever was handed to her. "I think that's true of more than just legs, Silas. I think that's true of almost everything a person loses and decides they're better off not trying to get back." You didn't let yourself believe that. Not about me, not about yourself either, much as I imagine you had every reason to, the way this town treated you. "No," Evelyn agreed. "I didn't. I don't think I know how to anymore, even when it might be easier. My mother used to say that surviving and living were two different things, and a person could spend a whole life doing the first without ever managing the second. I watched my father almost choose the first, sitting in that chair believing his leg was finished, and I watched my mother refuse to let him, day after day, no matter how much he hollered about it. I think I decided a long time ago which one I meant to do with whatever life I had left, however little choice I seemed to have in how that life got arranged." Silas was quiet a moment, watching her in the fading evening light, and then he said, low and rough in the way that had come to mean he was saying something that cost him, something true. "I didn't expect to find a partner in a marriage built out of a town's desperation to be rid of both of us," he said. "I expected to share a roof with a stranger until one of us wore the other down to nothing, same as everybody in Coldwater Flat expected. I didn't expect this." He gestured vaguely at the garden, the ranch, the two of them standing in the last of the autumn light. "I didn't expect to want this, Evelyn. To want you. Not as an arrangement, as a wife. As the person I'd choose if anybody asked me now, knowing everything I know." Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight and careful since the day she'd walked up that dirt road with her whole life packed into one trunk, certain she was walking into nothing more than a practical, joyless survival. And she reached out and took his hand, the same hand he'd taken hers with on this same porch months before, except now there was nothing careful or tentative in it at all. "I didn't expect it either," she said. "I think that's the truth of most things worth having, Silas. Nobody expects them. They just arrive slow and stubborn while you're busy doing something else, and one day you look up and realize the thing you thought you'd never have again has been sitting right beside you for months, waiting for you to notice it." "And have you noticed it?" "I've noticed it," Evelyn said, and when he leaned down and kissed her there in the failing light, among the last of the season's beans, it carried none of the flat, practical resignation of their wedding day months before, only the slow, hard-won warmth of two people who had built something real out of what everyone else had written off as nothing worth building at all. Gideon Blackwell's trial, when it finally came before the circuit judge that winter, did not take long to resolve once the evidence was laid out properly. Evelyn's ledgers, cross-referenced against Granger's own store records, once the man finally found the courage to testify honestly about the note Gideon held over his business. Tully's account of the fence, given calm and unwavering despite Gideon's lawyer's attempts to rattle him. Dr. Hale's medical notes, read into the record by the old doctor himself, his voice steady even as his hands trembled with age.
and the correspondence the sheriff had found regarding the Whitfield land, which turned out, on further investigation, to implicate Gideon in a scheme stretching back nearly 5 years across 3 different ranches in the valley, each one weakened, drained,
and ultimately abandoned by families who'd never understood why their luck had turned so consistently bad, until a stranger's books finally laid the pattern bare. The judge sentenced him to a long term at the territorial prison, and Coldwater Flat, for its part, did what towns always do once a comfortable lie has been stripped away and replaced with an uncomfortable truth. It talked about little else for months, reassessed 30 years of memories in light of what it now knew, and slowly, grudgingly, came around to admitting that the desperate widow it had married off without asking had turned out to be the only person in the whole valley with the spine and the patience to see what nobody else had wanted to look at closely enough to find. Otis Granger, freed at last from the note Gideon had held over him, settled into honest business again, charging fair prices same as every other merchant in the valley. And he made a point, every time Evelyn came into his store, of giving her the best cut of whatever she'd come for, free of charge. A quiet apology offered the only way a man like that knew how to offer one. Pete the clerk got himself a raise out of it, and a wedding the following spring to a girl from 2 towns over, and he never did stop thanking Evelyn every chance he got for being the kind of woman who'd noticed a nervous young clerk fussing with tins that didn't need fussing and waited patiently instead of pushing. Tully stayed on at the ranch, same as always, though Silas gave him a raise too, and more responsibility besides, telling him plainly one evening that a man who'd risk standing up in a church hall full of his neighbors to say a hard truth out loud was a man worth trusting with more than just fence mending. By the time spring came round again, the Rowan Ranch looked nothing like the gray, peeling, half-neglected place Evelyn had ridden up to nearly a year before. The porch post that had been propped with fence rail got properly replaced. The house got a fresh coat of paint, white with green trim, Evelyn's choice, made over a long evening of debate that ended, as most of their debates did by then, with Silas grumbling his way into agreeing with her and then admitting, once it was done, that she'd been right. The kitchen garden, that first season's tangle of weeds, came up thick and orderly under Evelyn's care, and Bertie, no longer managing the whole house alone twice a week, took to coming round most days now simply because she liked the company, and because she said, more than once, that she'd never seen Silas Rowan look so much like his old self, the self she remembered from before the accident, the boy who used to laugh easy and ride out before dawn just to watch the light come up. Silas did ride out before dawn again that spring, the first time since the accident, and he asked Evelyn to come with him, the 2 of them sitting their horses side by side on the rise above the north pasture as the sky went from black to gray to a slow spreading gold that lit up the whole valley like something being remade in front of them. "I used to think this hour belonged only to me," Silas said quietly, watching the light move across the grass. "I think I was wrong about that too. I think it's better having someone to watch it with." "Most things are," Evelyn said. "I spent a long while believing otherwise, believing a person was better off keeping their grief and their plans and their whole self to themselves, on account of trusting anybody else with it just gave them one more way to take something from you when they decided to leave or die, or turn out to be exactly the kind of man Gideon Blackwell turned out to be. And now? Now I think the right person doesn't take anything from you at all," Evelyn said. "They just stand beside you while you carry it, and somehow the weight of it gets easier without either of you noticing exactly when that happened." They sat together a long while, watching the sun climb fully over the ridge, the ranch spread out below them, whole and healthy and entirely their own. Not handed down by a town's tidy arithmetic, not managed by a man counting coins he considered already his, but built, slowly and stubbornly, by 2 people who'd been thrown together by other people's decisions and had chosen, somewhere along the way, to make something real out of an arrangement that had started as nothing more than mutual desperation. That was the thing about this whole valley, Evelyn thought, watching the cattle move slow and unbothered across the pasture below. It was a hard place, built by hard people, and it had not been kind to her. Not at the start, not when it mattered most. It had decided her fate without asking her opinion of it, the same way it had let a man like Gideon Blackwell go 30 years unquestioned simply because questioning him was harder than trusting him. But the valley hadn't broken her either, and it hadn't broken Silas, not in the end, not permanently, however close both of them had come to letting it. There was something in that worth holding on to, she thought. Not forgiveness exactly, for a town that had treated her so carelessly, but a kind of clear-eyed understanding that people, towns, whole valleys full of decent and indecent souls alike, were capable of getting things badly wrong, and still, eventually, given enough proof and enough patience, capable of getting them right. Belonging, she'd come to understand over the long months of ledgers and walking exercises and careful, dangerous questions asked in town, was not something a place handed you simply because you showed up and asked for it nicely. It was not something Coldwater Flat had owed her, and it was not something this ranch had owed Silas either, not by right of birth or by right of suffering. It was something built, day by stubborn day, out of choices nobody else made for you. The choice to keep asking questions when it would have been easier to stop. The choice to keep working a ruined leg long after a doctor had pronounced it finished. The choice to stand up in a hostile room and lay the truth out plain rather than let a town's comfortable lies stand unchallenged, simply because challenging it was dangerous. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, watching her face in the growing light. "That I came to this valley with nothing but a busted rocking chair and a trunk of clothes," Evelyn said, "and a town that had already decided what kind of life I deserved to have. And I'm thinking that none of them were right about it. Not about you, not about me, not about what either of us was capable of building once somebody finally bothered to look close enough to see it." "They weren't right about much of anything," Silas agreed, "except maybe the one thing they got right by accident, which was putting the two of us together in the first place, even if they did it for all the wrong reasons." "Maybe that's how the right things sometimes happen," Evelyn said. "Not because anybody planned them well, but because two people decided once they were standing in the wreckage together to build something worth having out of it anyway." Silas reached over and took her hand, the same gesture that had become as natural to both of them now as breathing, and they sat together on the rise as the full morning light spread out gold and warm across the ranch below. The cattle, the fences mended and sound, the house with its fresh white paint, the whole life they had built together out of a marriage neither of them had wanted, and both of them, now, would not trade for anything the world might have offered instead. The frontier sky stretched wide and clear above them, the same sky that had watched a desperate widow walk up a dirt road with nothing to her name, the same sky that had watched a broken man decide, slowly and stubbornly, that he was not yet finished. And beneath it, the two of them sat together, partners in every sense that mattered now, having turned a town's careless arithmetic into something neither arithmetic nor circumstance had ever intended. A life, hard-won and entirely their own, built not on what they'd been handed, but on what they'd refused to let go of, together, when everyone else had already decided to let go.